everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm John Schlichting, your host for this presentation. Before we get started, a quick plug to support the authors by purchasing their books from our wonderful bookseller partner, Politics and Prose, one of America's premier independent bookstores. We have links to purchase in the presentation description. Given all we've been through over the past year, it's so important to support local jobs and the local economy. I want to extend a big thank you to our 2021 feature sponsor, the David and Michael Blair Family Foundation, for their generous support. Okay, let's get started. Tonight we have with us two highly acclaimed authors here to discuss their latest books, both on our first president, George Washington. George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father by David O. Stewart is a fascinating account of how Washington became the single most dominant force in the creation of the United States of America. David O. Stewart is a best-selling writer of history and historical fiction, exploring topics such as the Constitutional Convention, the gifts of James Madison, Aaron Burr's treason trial, and the impeachment trial of President Andrew Johnson. He has won the Washington Writing Award for Best Book, the History Prize of the Society of the Cincinnati, and the Prescott Award of the National Society of Colonial Dames of America. George Washington's Final Battle, The Epic Struggle to Build a Capital City and a Nation by Robert P. Watson, delves into Washington's involvement in the establishment of a capital city and describes how the process nearly tore our young and vulnerable country apart. Robert P. Watson is a professor, historian, and author with over 40 published books and hundreds of scholarly articles. He has served as a visiting scholar at many historic sites, including presidential libraries, museums, and universities, and was an analyst for NBC and PBS for many years. Several of his books have won awards, including The Nazi Titanic, The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn, An Untold Story of the American Revolution, and America's First Crisis. Welcome, David and Robert.
I drew the straw to start first, and it's the story I tried to tell was intriguing to me because I became aware of something a lot of people know, which is Washington won key elections in his life. He was elected commander-in-chief of the Army. He was elected president of the Constitutional Convention. He was elected president twice, of course. But the kicker is he was elected unanimously. And you don't get that with box tops. That was a big deal in this 18th century, and it's unimaginable today. So I wanted to try to understand how that happened. What was the magic that he was able to apply to make that happen? And the story I found was different maybe from the one we all think we know about George Washington. He was not an instant success, or it wasn't easy. He was the third son of a planter of the second rank, not an elite figure in Virginia by any means. His father died when he was 11, and when you were the third son, you didn't get very much in those days, and he didn't. He got some pretty shop-worn assets, and because he was 11, his mother took them over anyway, and she was right to do that. She had 5 little kids to raise as a single mom. So he goes to work when he's 16. He's not had the sort of formal education his 2 older brothers had, or that he wished he had. He was always embarrassed about his lack of formal education. And he goes to work because he needs the money, which is not how we think of George Washington usually, through connections. And he's got these wonderful next door neighbors to Mount Vernon, the Fairfaxes, who own most of Northern Virginia and are incredibly powerful. And they sponsor him, and he becomes, at a very young age, the head of the Virginia regiment fighting the French and Indians on the Western frontier. And it's a great opportunity, it seems, but then it turns out to be a terrible opportunity because the Indians are wonderful forest fighters and Virginians are not. And he has basically 3 years on the frontier where nothing goes well. Ambushes, massacres, he doesn't win anything. And it's really miserable. He is miserable, and he becomes testy, and he manages to alienate basically all of his superiors within the British military establishment and the royal governor of Virginia, who gave him the job. And he alienates them honestly. He says rotten things to them, and he jumps the chain of command, and he goes behind their backs. And when he finally resigns his commission, I think they're all delighted to see him leave. And he doesn't have a career in the military world that he had hoped to have. He then decides, I think, to reinvent himself as a political figure, as a squire in the classic Virginia tradition. He lucks into Mount Vernon. 3 close relatives have to die for him to get it, but he gets it. And he marries an extremely wealthy woman, a widow, Martha Custis. And he sets off on a career that most people ignore when they write about Washington and think about him. He spends 16 years in the Virginia House of Burgesses as a legislator. It's the colonial legislature. He spends a decade on the parish vestry, which had many public responsibilities, including taking care of the poor. And he also spends 6 years on the Fairfax County Court, which it sounds very judicial. It was partly, but it also was administrative. It had responsibility for figuring out the roads, for the ferries, running tobacco warehouses for the export business. And Washington was always extraordinarily good at administrative work, executive action. And in these roles, he creates a new person, as near as I can see. Now, of course, like all of us, he tries to build on his strengths and mute his weaknesses. That's what growing up is all about. And he does it in an interesting way. He's no orator. He's got not a very good voice. He doesn't trust his education to mix it up in debate. So he needs to develop a quiet leadership style. And there's a wonderful episode I emphasize, which I think highlights some of his challenge. In the House of Burgesses, early on, he brings this legislation forward to end the running of pigs in the city of Winchester, which is a western frontier city. And if you have pigs running through town, not in pens, you're not in a civilized place. I mean, they go to the bathroom when they want, and it's ugly, and they break into your storage. I mean, it's lousy. So he brings this legislation, which really I could not understand why it was controversial. Did the pigs have lobbyists? It was confusing, but he loses. He can't get it through. And another legislator, a very smart lawyer in Virginia named Edmund Pendleton, takes over the bill. He reinvents it as a bill to protect the water quality in Winchester, because of course, if they're defecating everywhere, it goes into the wells, and it's bad. And it sails through. And it's just a very small window into just how, if I dare I say it, how clueless he was, that he needed to learn a lot. And he does. It takes him a while. He doesn't rocket to the top of the political ladder, but he creates a new persona built on talents he has. He's always the tallest guy in the room. He always looks good. He was very fussy about his presentation, his clothing. He developed this quiet style where he made himself a great listener. And he would hear people out. He developed a consultative style. I think maybe time on the court helped him with that. So as a young man, as a military leader, he'd been a bit reckless, going with his gut too often. And he develops an approach where he wants to hear from smart people. He's going to make up his own mind, but he wants to know what smart people think about something. He has the ability to make shrewd judgments about people. He's always got that talent. And he has extraordinary energy. He gets up at 4 a.m. He looks over everything on the plantation, and then he goes off and he rides he doesn't rest until 3 p.m. He has basically worked for 10 hours. He has a meal, and then he works a few more hours, and then he has supper, and he sometimes works more. And that sort of energy, well directed, makes a huge difference in your life. Something that struck me that I wasn't expecting about him is it turned out, by my interpretation, he had a great emotional accessibility to just a gift with people, not necessarily in a large group, although he was a tremendous performer. John Adams called him the best actor we've ever had as president. But he was referred to by many contemporaries, and this surprised me, as affable, which is not how we think of him. We see this, marble bust, and, he's the marble man. But in fact, people enjoyed his company. There was a French officer who described traveling through early America with him, and he said it was as though he was everybody's father and everybody's brother. And that sort of emotional accessibility, I think, was a key to his leadership style. John Adams called it his gift of silence, which was a gift John Adams didn't have, but it made a difference. And I was surprised to discover that on several occasions he wept in public. He was not embarrassed about it. He had feelings, and he showed them. And I think that ability was something that mattered as well. So I tried to take this understanding that I was working towards of how he remade himself. So when he gets to the First Continental Congress in 1774, he's George Washington. He's the guy we recognize as George Washington, and I think he is. And then look at specific episodes in his mature career where he demonstrates the political talents that he's developed. And just a quick overview, I focus on his 7 months at Valley Forge, when really the Army was at risk of unraveling. He needed to build bridges to Congress to make that work. He needed to repel an effort to replace him as commander-in-chief. There was actually a bureaucratic maneuver to get him out. And it turned out that he was pretty good at the political knife fight. And he was able to survive that cleanly. The second period I looked at is the transition to peacetime. His resignation from the Army is a huge moment. Reinforces the notion that he's a man who can be trusted. He doesn't lust after power. And in the period of drift in the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation, it is Washington's reputation and I think talents that end up bringing the country together in the Constitutional Convention and ratification of the Constitution. As president, there are two episodes I look at, especially the first is neutrality policy, to stay out of the European wars. The second, which I am going to leave to Robert because he's made the real study of it, is establishing the new government, and in particular, its seat of government, which was a central act in creating a nation. We sometimes forget, I mean, in these times, there was no tradition of the United States of America. The colonies were independent. They didn't think of themselves as one country, and they had to learn. And the only things they had that were unifying were the Army during the war, this new Constitution, and George Washington. Mm-hmm. And he played just such a central role. And I couldn't not address the slavery issue, which was a central part of his life, all his life. It takes him a fair number of years in his life before he appreciates the crime of slavery. He does come to appreciate it. He makes an effort to extract himself from slave ownership. He doesn't ever make that work because he doesn't have enough money to do it. It's a complicated story. I'm not going to dwell on it here. It's an interesting thing because he really wants to, but he can't. And where I do mark him down, to be honest, is he never speaks out. He speaks privately that we need to get rid of slavery, but never publicly. And this is a huge moral issue for the nation. And our greatest leader was silent. And that was a shame. I think he decided it wasn't going to change anything anyway. He made a pretty cold political calculation, but that was too bad. Most of us know about his freeing of his slaves and his will, which I see mostly as an act of personal atonement, not a political act. He wrote at one point, "I hope this action will not be displeasing to my maker." He had a load of guilt, which he had earned as a slave owner for many years. With that, I look forward to hearing from Robert on the final battle.
David, thank you. I am impressed. I agree with everything you said. And just for the audience, some of the awards David has won for his writing, his books are among the more prestigious in our field. David, if I may, I always like to ask authors what they learned new or how they changed their image of the subject. You said that you were a little surprised about Washington's emotional accessibility, as was I. Could you perhaps expand on that? And one of the things I've always said is when I tackle a subject, I oftentimes like them less as I get to know them more, with a few exceptions like Washington, Lincoln, Truman, I like more. But how did your view of Washington, did it evolve, or did you like him more or less? And if you could expand on that idea of his emotional accessibility being surprising to you.
You know, a lot of it is his moments of loss. Basically, most people who were important to him in life died in his life. All 8 of his siblings died before he did. His 2 stepchildren. And he writes plainly, directly about how much it hurts. And, I did a book on James Madison. There's nothing like that there. Aaron Burke, God knows, never wrote about it or said anything about it. But Washington, again, is not ashamed of it. And the one episode in particular involved his stepdaughter, who was cursed with epilepsy as a young girl and dies at the age of 15 at a family dinner. I mean, it's a horror. And he writes a terribly moving letter about it to one of his in-laws. And then he does something I hadn't noticed anybody else pick up on, which is he's got a lot of plans for the next 3 months and he cancels them all. And he stays at Mount Vernon and he stays with Martha. And he and Martha ride together, and they had never done that. Washington was a tremendous horseman and a great rider and a great athlete. And I think she probably couldn't keep up with him, and he'd get a little impatient, and it just wasn't the best. But in this time period, he stayed with her and he rode with her, and it's not heroic. It's not more than you would hope anybody would do, but he did it, and it was a picture of the real man that meant something to me.
And that's an important insight, as I think one of your contributions, one of your many, is peeling back the layers of the onion and trying to get at the real Washington, which, as you said at the outset, and I share your views, I've always said this, he comes across through the generations as just this statue. So I've always felt he was the hardest to know of all the founders, but stories like that provide us with an invaluable insight. Could I ask you another question, David? I also like to ask authors. Could you tell the audience and myself a little bit about your writing, your approach to writing, your approach to research? Do you have a certain room in the house? Do you have a certain time? Do you have a certain number of words per day? I always like to ask authors that.
I do as much as I can, and whatever needs to be done that day, I do. I work. I like to work. My wife has adjusted to it after 50 years. I don't have a target for to produce in a day, because there may be a day when I'm just reading. Maybe, I realize I've got a hole and I need to fill it. I don't know what happened. So it's just, there's something, as you know, with all the books you've written, there's so much to do and so much to know. It takes a lot of scrounging around and figuring out what came next.
Any big challenges during the research process? In a way, there's so much out there in Washington that it would seem to be, an easy project. But then because there's so much out there in Washington, to really find some new nuggets and insights as you've done and really flesh out the person and, rather than this caricature or this existing narrative that we often have on it. Any challenges during your research?
It's such a big life. And that's why I focused on the 5 episodes of his mature career, because I just couldn't face taking it all on. I mean, this took 5 years. So it was just too much. He's got 87 volumes of published papers. I mean, you've been through a lot of them. And it's great, but you can lose yourself in it. So you got to, at some point say, okay, I'm going to write.
Would you, I know some authors don't mind saying it, others like to keep it a secret, but do you have another book planned, or you're currently, can you let us know what's coming up next?
Well, it's something completely different. I have 3 novels I have actually written about, they're inspired by my family's stories, my mother's family. And the first one will come out in November, scheduled to, and it's about essentially them coming to America to start. The first one's in the 18th century and on the Maine coast. A bunch of Germans come over and get swindled by the Anglos. Then the Civil War is the volume 2 and World War II is volume 3. I had to do them as fiction because my mother was such an unreliable narrator. She just told great stories, and we always knew they probably weren't entirely true. So it became fiction. Thank you for asking.
Perhaps that's where you get your gift for storytelling, but yet your passion for making sure it's accurate, right?
You need both.
Yeah, no question. Well, thanks, David. That's a tough act to follow. I'll say that the idea behind my book, George Washington's Final Battle, which is you heard John say at the outset and you heard David allude to, it's a story about Washington building the capital city and doing so, really forging a nation, this young fledgling republic. I got the idea in 2 respects. One which ties to what David just said. But first off, we all love our capital city. We love the tree-lined mall, the world-class Smithsonian's. We love I love all the monuments and touching memorials to our heroes and the fallen, the majestic government buildings. But few people know the story behind the capital city. Why was it located where it was? The design, the architecture, and of course, all the political twists and turns behind it, which is a heck of a story. So I wanted to tell that. The second reason why I wrote the book really ties into, I think, a lot of David's work here. And that was, I've always seen Washington as the least accessible of all the framers, all the great founders. He has come across to us as more monument than man, more myth than flesh and blood. And I particularly like the story David shared about him canceling a lot of his engagements over 3 months, because that's what I think we need to do. We need to breathe more life into Washington. And in particular, and again, here I overlap with David and agree completely with this argument. I've always seen Washington as more political than we oftentimes see the narrative or the pop culture depiction of him. Washington had political talents, as David said. Washington could reinvent himself politically. Now, I wouldn't put Washington as a political chess master like an Abraham Lincoln or an arm twister like an LBJ, let's say, or he clearly wasn't a gifted orator of perhaps an FDR or JFK. But nonetheless, Washington had a set of political skills And I agree with David. And set of instincts on reading people. He also had charisma, and he was well aware of his charisma. He was always the biggest guy in the room. He was a big man, physically a large man. By today's parlance, yeah, an athlete, a great horseman, a real presence, and that raw charisma. And he knew that. He also knew he was not that well educated and not that articulate. So he kind of wills himself and plays the role, the cards that he was given. But he was a politician. There's a story I flesh out in the book of a vote on a key issue. And they were 4 votes shy in the Senate. And of course, the Senate was a lot smaller than today. This would be like, 40 votes shy in the Senate or something. So they were 4 votes shy in the Senate, and Washington asked Madison and others to call for a revote. And, people were kind of scratching their head. We need time to work on this. They were 4 votes shy. Well, they called for an immediate revote. In the interim, Washington visits 4 senators and flipped all 4 of them. We don't have the details behind it, but one can only imagine somebody sitting in their office and the door opens, and filling up the doorwell is George Washington, who said, I'm going to need you to do something for me. And I'll be darned if they didn't. So, that's an example. The other aspect of Washington, which also David alluded to, is I've always seen Washington's life as a quest for self-improvement. He was aware of his weaknesses and worked and did reinvent himself into making himself, quite an amazing leader. And he was more introspective than I think people realize. I agree, more emotional. I agree, more accessible, and a little less standoffish than he's usually depicted. But 2 aspects of that I wanted to flesh out. One, Washington was creative and innovative. During the Revolutionary War, he didn't know what he was doing. He did not have the classic military training, which ended up probably being a good thing, because what's the critique? Generals are always fighting the last war that they learned about in their training. Washington, he was making it up as he was going along. He was like my grandmother throwing spaghetti on the wall, right? See what sticks. But he had to be very innovative, very creative. As the first president, you see this again and again with David's book. So there was no template. The framers created an altogether new form of government. They went beyond what the Roman Senate had done. They went far beyond what the classic Greek philosophers had even contemplated in a government that Lincoln would later call of, by, and for the people. So Washington didn't have a template. Through his every action and inaction, through everything he said and didn't say, he was forging an office and forging a nation. So again, he didn't know what he was doing. He had to be creative and fill in the blanks. And you even see this as the farmer, George Washington. Washington was a very innovative farmer. He had aquaculture. He was doing fish farming. He was trying to grow things that shouldn't grow in the poor soil of the Tidewater, Virginia region or off the Potomac. Washington was very innovative, very creative. He was ordering new farming technology and books on seed and everything from architecture to farming. He would order through his London merchant and was always trying to improve himself. And I think the ultimate view of Washington's passion, his vision and creativity, he was more of a visionary, and his political talents, it all comes together in what? Forging a capital city, building a capital city. That's where you see him put his political stock. He puts it on the table. He uses his gifts. He's a visionary and looking at a brand new form of a capital and so on. So the backdrop for this story of the capital, really, you can see it after the war. We won the war. Now what? I found headlines, of course, in newspapers and stories where people and writers said things like, have we really fought for this? We don't have a functioning government. You have the Articles of Confederation, which took from 77 to 1781 to even get ratified. It was one branch of government. It was wholly ineffective and ineffectual. The British, we kicked the British out, but when the British left, they took the physicians and the moneyed people and the lawyers and the educated. What did we have left? We couldn't pay our veterans. We couldn't, field a standing army. We couldn't pay back our debts to Europe. Our currency was worthless. The states were bickering. Now what? So in some ways, it was probably easier to win a war for the ability to govern than to actually govern. Where the rubber meets the road was the new challenge. And, Washington had said that he longed for retirement under his, beloved vine and fig, go back to Mount Vernon, but his work was not yet done. So in that vacuum after the war, Washington emerges. And based on his letters and letters from others, you could see that Washington identified a series of basic problems. One of them was this: the Revolutionary War starts in 1775. It doesn't end until 1783. We went the whole way through the war without a permanent seat of government. We created a brand new nation without a permanent seat of government. That's no way to start a nation or a country. We didn't have a capital. There were over 30 cities under consideration at one point or another, from Albany and New York City to Baltimore and Annapolis to Harrisburg and Lancaster to Williamsburg. There were a number of cities under consideration. And one of the problems Washington saw was parochialism. Everybody wanted their city or state and not another one. So Pennsylvania would conspire against New York, and New York would conspire against Pennsylvania. Annapolis conspired against Baltimore, and Baltimore conspired against Annapolis. One of the reasons was economics. The British had blockaded our eastern seaboard. The economy was in ruin. So people knew that if you got the capital, you would get the government moving in, the military moving in, the Congress moving in, and that meant an economic windfall. Boarding houses and restaurants and economic activity. So everybody wanted the capital. There was even a joke at one point. Ben Franklin at one point said, maybe we need multiple capitals, or maybe we need a revolving capital. And there was a funny joke about the Trojan horse, alluding to how unpopular Congress was. The joke among a lot of the members of Congress was, maybe we should build a Trojan horse, put Congress in the belly, and sneak it into a city at night, let them quick get out and do the business, load it back up, and sneak out to the next city. So we couldn't get a capital. So enter George Washington. And he really identifies 4 problems. And this is what's so remarkable to me. It should have been Ben Franklin. It should have been John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. I mean, we had some remarkable Renaissance men. Well-educated, well-traveled, extraordinary intellects. But it wasn't them that identified these core problems and came up with a solution. It was the one man among them who wasn't well-traveled, wasn't well-educated. One trip abroad in his life as a teenager, he spent a few days in Barbados, right? So it was Washington, though, and I think it was the creativity, the innovation, the ability to think out of the box. So here's 4 of the problems that I focus on in the book. Number 1, the government was not going to endure. As soon as the Revolutionary War was ending, in March of 1783, at his headquarters in Newburgh along the Hudson in New York, there's a mutiny, the Newburgh Conspiracy. And as David noted and fleshes out in his book, there were efforts to remove Washington. Washington's realizing, just as we're ready to seize victory, we're going to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Then in June of 1783, there's a mutiny in Philadelphia. A group of unpaid veterans, drunks, pour out of pubs in Philly, and they surround the building we now know as Independence Hall, sort of like the insurrection on January 6th, threatening to grab people and civil disobedience and civil insurrection. And this scares the hell out of Washington. He realizes this government may not endure. We are in debt. So that's the first one. What do we do about the government? The second problem is factions and sectionalism. We're already seeing the North-South rift. We're already seeing the formation of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and the factions between the Adams and Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians and Madisonians. And we're already seeing this rift. And Washington, of course, was displeased and worried about that. And of course, we today in our politics see the inevitability of all that. The third problem he really identifies is we have no credibility in the eyes of Europe. We are a cultural backwater. We're an upstart. We're a republic in an era of monarchs. And of course, the image of America is a bunch of people running around the wilds wearing, deerskin and raccoon hats, not too far off the mark in some places. So how do we conduct treaties with? How do we have alliances with? How do we deal with Europe if we can't repay them and we don't have any credibility? That's the third problem. And the fourth problem, which David also alluded to, is we don't have a spirit of, I guess, an American identity, if you will, or a spirit of nationalism in the good sense, not the excessive sense that we see in some cases. If you were to ask Thomas Jefferson about his country or his nation, he would say Virginia. If If you were asked Ben Franklin, he would say, I left my Massachusetts for my Pennsylvania, you know? So we didn't have United States, small letter U, describing capital letter S, the states. You know, you find letters that say these, plural, United States. Instead of capital letter U, noun, singular, the United States. So that's the fourth problem. How does Washington address all these problems? A capital city, a grand and glorious Romanesque, inspired by Rome, a city for the ages. You locate it halfway between the north and south, and it helps bring it together. If it's too far in the south, too far in the north, one half of the faction isn't happy. How do you imbue the people with a sense of national identity if you have a small, you know, federal town with a couple of brick buildings? You don't. If you have a glorious Romanesque capital. The capital city, as they stated in the Constitution, something David's written about, you know, a 10 miles square. This is 100 miles, everybody. This would, you know, put Paris and London to shame. This is quite an ambitious undertaking. The government won't endure. Well, if we imbue the government with legitimacy, strength, it could endure. And you have basically two visions for the capital. One is led by Jefferson and Southerners and kind of a slave-owning vision. Jefferson's federal town, as he called it, just a few acres, single-story brick buildings, separated by fields and woods and forests. Well, think of the architecture of politics, or the politics of architecture. If the federal government is just a couple small brick buildings, then the states are supreme. There's not a challenge to the institution of slavery. If you have a great and glorious Rome on the Potomac, then you know, the federal government is imbued with power, and that could change the equation. So Washington really challenges his fellow Southerners and the Jeffersonian model in envisioning this brand new, incredible capital city. Now, furthermore, Washington's cognizant of, and I think, you know, one of the biggest surprises for me in all this is, you know, you don't think of Washington as a deep thinker or, you know, philosophically bent. And he oftentimes wasn't. He was, you know, he learned his life lessons in, you know, surveying and fighting Indians in what was then the wilderness, right? But Washington realizes we have a brand new, you know, heretofore unknown system of government. We're going to create a brand new capital, and they're going to grow up together. And that capital city will influence the development of this new nation in countless ways, which I think is just an extraordinary way of thinking about it. And again, I'm surprised that it was Washington and it wasn't a Ben Franklin or a John Adams, two of the other founders I quite enjoy. So they would grow up together and shape the development of it. And Washington plays a critical role in all this. You know, he helps select the site for where the capital will be. Now, from a self-interest perspective, it happens to be near land he owns, happens to be near Mount Vernon, and it happens to be near his beloved Potomac. And there was even something of a joke. I found countless letters. Some of the other founders teased and said Washington had Potomac fever. He was obsessed with the Potomac, which to his credit, he had canoed and had surveyed and charted and all that. He knew it and he loved it. Washington even silly, sort of naively at once alludes to the Potomac as greater than the Thames or the Rhine or the Danube. You know, all, you know, the Tigris and Euphrates, it's the Potomac, but you got to forgive him that he wasn't well traveled. But, and we knew we needed to place the capital next to a river, which is why the Hudson, the Susquehanna, and other rivers were in the equation. So he's going to forge a brand new capital. Washington helps select the site. Washington surveys a lot of it. Washington picks the architects. He picks L'Enfant, the famous French architect and engineer, who he knew through his service during the Revolutionary War. He was also a Mason, that helped. But L'Enfant was classically trained in Paris. And most importantly, L'Enfant shared Washington's vision of a glorious capital for the ages, channeling Rome and inspired by Paris. The grand boulevards that intersect where there's public squares, and each would be filled with memorials and monuments and, you know, glorious marble-esque looking buildings. So L'Enfant shared Washington's exaggerated view of the capital. Washington picks the architect for the building that's today the White House, another immigrant, James Hoban from Ireland. Washington is part of the effort to get the Scottish stonemasons to come in and provide all the beautiful embellishments on the building. So Washington plays a role. He even plays a role in selling the plots of land and trying to raise funding for this. So from beginning to end, Washington is intimately involved in this. I think the idea, and I agree with David, during his presidency, one of the great things Washington did was he had his eyes on the ball of creating a nation. And part of that was creating a capital. And you could really say the last 10 years of his life, he was darn near obsessed with the idea of a capital. He visited the site. He hires the 3 federal commissioners who oversee the city. He demands regular updates and reports. He stays intimately involved in it. Now, let me just say one more thing, and I'll bring this to a close then. The deal making, of course, is everybody's seen Hamilton, the musical, right? Which I love. My 20-year-old son is actually named for Alexander Hamilton, which he now tells all of his friends, David, very proud. He didn't like his name before. Now he thinks it's cool, right? Because anybody under the age of 30 thinks Hamilton's the bomb. And I always remind my colleagues and fellow historians that I was on the Hamilton bandwagon, 20 some years ago when my son was being born. But although I've always said it's easy to love Hamilton, but it's hard to like him. He was very complicated, as they all were. John Adams I love, but he was complicated. Jefferson, it could be an acquired taste. Madison is an interesting guy and a complicated guy in many ways, and they all were, quite frankly. Ben Franklin, foremost perhaps among them. So the dinner party on June 20th, 1790, as they wrap in the musical, the room where it happened. So you have 2 factions, the Jeffersonian faction and the Hamiltonian faction, the less government, the more government, the South, the North, just to make it simplistic and not digress. The problem for Jefferson was whenever he and Hamilton butted heads, Hamilton typically carried the day. Why? Because of Washington. Washington was more ideologically aligned with Hamilton, Adams, and that faction, the Federalists. But Washington saw Hamilton as more of his son, Hamilton seeing Washington as the father figure he really never had. And Hamilton as Washington's right-hand man, as they say in the musical. Washington would side with Hamilton, including on neutrality, which David fleshes out in his book, as opposed to Jefferson's involvement on behalf of France in that issue. So on June 19th, the day before, Jefferson's waiting outside of Washington's office house, and he hears a great commotion. And Washington and Hamilton have a fight. And both Washington and Hamilton had volcanic tempers. Part of Washington's legendary stoicism can be contributed to maybe a lifelong effort, I should say, to control his temper and present himself in another way. That self-improvement that I talked about, that reinvention that David talked about. So Hamilton comes out. Jefferson wrote that he never seen Hamilton so dejected. So Jefferson's going to move quickly, right? He invites Hamilton to dinner the next night. He's going to get him while Hamilton and Washington have a rift. And to team up on him, he invites his right-hand man, Madison, one of the great intellects of the founding. So Jefferson and Madison against Hamilton. And they have to resolve a couple of pressing issues, just 2 among them. One would be the location of the capital, and the other one would be the question of the debt, as they called it, federal debt assumption. So where should the capital be? Now, Hamilton wants it in the North, at one point in New York. Jefferson and Southerners wanted it in the South. It was darn near non-negotiable. The South could walk if they don't get it in the South. And of course, Jefferson, Madison wanted in their beloved Virginia, leading Adams and others to joke, only in Virginia are all geese swans, right? To Jefferson and Madison's surprise, it seems that, now we don't have a lot of sources for this. We have secondary sources. Jefferson would later write an reimagined version of this meeting, trying to put himself in favorable light. He would later admit that when he realized that Hamilton duped him, it was the worst moment of his political life because he didn't like Hamilton. Hamilton agrees that the capital goes in Virginia in the South. Jefferson and Madison couldn't believe it. But what Hamilton knew was Washington was already eyeing up the edge of the Potomac. Now, on the question of debt, the South, Virginia, didn't want to contribute toward the debt assumption. Some Southern states had covered their debts. A lot of the fighting of the war and the cost of the war were borne by the northern states, and Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts were in a pickle to try to pay back their debts. So Jefferson and Madison don't want the South to pay back their debts. They're not going to contribute. Now, what they didn't realize is by them not contributing, the federal government would have to assume the debts. And who wanted that? Hamilton. Hamilton was the Treasury Secretary. It makes him one of the most powerful people in the government. And if the federal government assumes debts, now we need a bank, we need a currency, we need a strong treasury, all the things that Hamilton wanted, and federal debt assumption. So Hamilton pretty much plays Jefferson and the brilliant Madison like a guitar and gets all that he wants. Later, there would be another interesting exchange that Jefferson, pursuing his idea of a little simple federal town of one-story brick buildings, Jefferson proposes that we have a design contest. And how democratic is this? The public submits their designs. Jefferson proposes, I'll serve on the committee that picks the winning design. In fact, I'll chair it. Gee, thanks, Tom. He picks his own design, basically, which was probably submitted anonymously. But what he doesn't realize is when he takes that to Hamilton and Washington, Washington pretty much says, nope, we're going with mine and L'Enfant's. So I'll bring it to a close by saying I think that Washington has many extraordinary legacies, and as David noted, winning all those important elections, even at the local level, and presiding at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 to 2 terms, to stepping down both as general and as president, really creating some remarkable customs. And part of his greatness is not what he did, but what he didn't do in that respect. But I think what he did do was forge this capital city. And for the life of me, if Washington wasn't in the equation, we don't have that strong, grand, glorious capital. And the questions of the problems that I discussed earlier about whether that government would long endure, I think would be rethought, would be wholly different. And of course, there was a consideration as to what we should name the capital city. And, everybody knew. One of the ideas was Washingtonopolis. Now, I'm just nerdy enough to say it's scary, but part of me thinks it's funny and interesting. But now, thankfully, they dropped the opolis. We just went with Washington. Washington doesn't live to see his beloved capital open. He dies on December 14, 1799. The capital city finally opens on November 1st, 1800, a year later, when John Adams moves in. It wasn't the city that we know today, everybody. A couple of buildings, fields of mud because they cut everything down. Adams was disgusted by, and Abigail even more so, by the presence of slaves building our city, which is quite ironic that because we didn't have the money, we would have to rely on slave labor. One interesting story I flesh out in the book is one of the folks who helped survey and set it up was Benjamin Banneker, a former slave and an extraordinary self-taught engineer, architect, astronomer, surveyor, who worked with Andrew Ellicott, Washington, and L'Enfant in surveying the city. So that's, I think, kind of poetic. But Adams was disgusted by the sight of slaves building a city. Only 6 rooms in the White House were finished. The roof leaked. There was no place for Abigail to hang her laundry, to get running water, and the building reeked of fresh plaster. All night and all day long, there was the hammering and sawing of construction. So it wasn't the city it was. But Adams recognized, Adams didn't play hardly any role in any of this capital city debate, which is odd because John Adams was intimately involved in virtually every decision for years in the founding of this country, but not in the capital. But he does recognize Washington's extraordinary vision. And he does recognize that he is a front row seat to history as he moves in. And he writes a letter containing sort of a poetic verse. He writes a letter to Abigail, who did not travel with him, where he kind of cryptically says, the building is in a situation to be inhabited, basically, knowing that Abigail wouldn't like what she found, but she comes down. But then he writes of the building we now know as the White House. He writes a prayer, which at the end of FDR's life was engraved in the mantle of one of the fireplaces. He says, I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings upon this house and all who will hereafter inhabit it. May none but wise and honorable men ever serve under this roof. And that today is in the White House. And I think that's part of the great vision of George Washington and his extraordinary efforts, his political acumen, his vision, his creativity in just getting this capital city founded and built, which ensured the survival of our republic. So thank you for that. I'd like to thank David. It's an honor to be on with him and to be a part of this wonderful book festival. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, David and Robert. That was fantastic. Thank you for being here tonight. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this presentation. We have an amazing lineup of programs for both adults and children throughout the month of May. You don't want to miss any of it. Please go to our website, gaithersburgbookfestival.org, and look over the schedule so that you can plan your festival month. Before you go, we have a special message for you from the amazing author and bookstore owner, Ann Patchett. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm Ann Patchett here at Parnassus Books with my dog Sparky, and I want to tell you the importance of supporting your local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. They are a remarkable partner with this book festival. Now, when a book festival is live, it's really easy. You just go to the table and you buy your book and then you go to the event. But when a book festival is virtual, it gets a little trickier because you're home and you might think, well, you know, I'll just buy the book on Amazon. So I'm here to tell you, don't buy the book on Amazon. For one thing, Jeff Bezos has enough money, right? He's trying to colonize the moon or something. He doesn't need anything that you've got. Politics and Prose, on the other hand, they're your local independent bookstore, and you love them, and they bring you so many events. They work harder than any bookstore I know in their community. And if you want them to be there alive and healthy and well when all this is over, you actually need to support them. They are the people that are putting a tax base in your community, okay? So you have teachers and police officers and firefighters, and when you pay a couple dollars more for a book, you're creating jobs in your community. So enjoy your book festival, support Politics and Prose. Remember, Ann Patchett and Sparky think it's the thing to do. Shop local. Thank you.